of this. So if you do have questions that are more general or any questions on any of the topics I cover, go ahead and put that question in the chat box right when you think of it. And Karen will be helping with answering some of those at the end of the presentation. I think that's all the housekeeping stuff. So I am going to get started with my actual slides, if they will advance on my computer. There we go. All right, so again, this is my name. I'm Samantha Sharp. I am employed at Nationwide Children's Hospital, but I'm the liaison with Ohio State. And I work within the CCTS, which is the Center for Clinical and Translational Sciences. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose, but there is my email address, and also my LinkedIn page are linked as part of this presentation. So if you do want to reach out for any additional follow-up or questions, I would love to talk to you. Today we are going to have, like I said, a general overview talking about roles and responsibilities to consider when you are launching an investigator-initiated trial. And then we're going to talk about some blind spots for investigator-initiated trials and how to navigate them, and then learn more about the resources at NCH and OSU. So a little bit of background. I have been in the research field since 2009, and I actually started at the bench in a microbiology lab. That's my training. And then I slowly moved into clinical research in a more research administration role. And for the last 5 years prior to taking my current role, I was the program manager for an infectious disease clinical research program at Nationwide Children's. So a lot of what I'm going to be presenting to you today are things that I learned. They were my blind spots, and I'm hoping that in sharing them with you, that will help you to navigate through what can sometimes be a confusing process with investigator-initiated studies. And I'm also hoping that by sharing some of the things I learned on the job, we can avoid those for you. So what we are going to talk about is just some definitions to make sure we're all on the same page, talk about what you need to get started, and then I'm going to go through just a couple different things to consider. And there is a checklist that I am going to be sharing with Karen to send to you all as follow-up of this. So you actually are going to get kind of a template and a checklist that you'll be able to use when you're going through your own study. So to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, I use the NIH Grants Policy Statement of what is an investigator-initiated trial. So this is research that is funded as the result of an investigator on his or her own submitting a research application. So this means that somebody had an idea, they submitted the research application, and in this case it's the NIH, but someone said, that's a great idea, we're going to give you money, go do it. So this could be the NIH, this could be a foundation, this could be a pharmaceutical sponsor, but really what we're talking about here is an investigator that had an idea and then got the go-ahead and the funding to conduct that idea. People also call them investigator-initiated studies. I flip back and forth between study and trial. Investigator-initiated sponsored research program. So these all are the same way of saying a unique setting where there are new ideas that are being conducted in clinical research, and investigator-initiated studies can be observational and they can be interventional. Because there are so many different types of clinical research studies, again, what we're doing today is just a broad overview, but I will point out different resources that will help you based on the type of study that you're conducting, and hopefully we will be able to give you some better resources. So the reason that Karen and I talked about giving this presentation is because the more and more we're seeing bench to bedside research, so translational research, come into the clinical research realm. And investigator-initiated trials are becoming more and more common, especially in institutions like Nationwide Children's and Ohio State, where we really prize innovation. So we are seeing more and more investigators partaking in this type of research. And a sponsor investigator is an investigator who both initiates and conducts the investigation. And if it is a trial in which a drug or intervention is happening, then that investigator is the one who has the immediate direction to administer and dispense the product. If it's an observational study, that means the investigator still initiates and conducts and has all of the responsibility of the study, and any requirement of the sponsor now also applies to the investigator. So the PI of an investigator-initiated trial has a lot of responsibility and requirements, and we, as their clinical research staff, are going to help them meet all of those requirements. So this is just an abbreviated summary of some of the requirements that a sponsor has, which in an IIT, the PI also has. So they have to select qualified investigators, provide those investigators with the information that they need to conduct the investigation properly, make sure there's proper monitoring of the trial, and select monitors who are qualified, ensure that the FDA or any other participating investigator is informed of any adverse events or risks, and maintain and retain adequate records and reports. So this means you're responsible for all operational aspects of the clinical trial. Staffing, study documents, and training. This is a huge part, the study documents and training. Usually, if you have a industry-sponsored study, that sponsor is providing to you all of the study documents. They're providing to you the protocol, the manual of procedures, or the manual of operations. They're providing to you the lab guide of how to process your samples. But when it's an investigator-initiated trial, there is no sponsor providing you those things. So study documents and training is a huge part of effectively managing an investigator-initiated trial. But then there's this middle box, data management and monitoring. You have to build your own databases. You have to make sure you have high data integrity, and you have to monitor your data all by yourself, essentially, because your investigator is your sponsor. So we're going to talk through a little bit of that during this webinar. You also have to be in charge of all of the regulatory components. And I mentioned here communication plans, because I think effectively communicating what's going on in the regulatory area of your study is very important, especially if it's an interventional study. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then maintaining records. So we want to make sure you've got great research records, which means the source documentation and the eventual database. So these are all different things that we're going to just, again, touch on during the webinar today, because when I first came into clinical research management, like I said, I came from the bench. So I had one point of view, and I learned a lot along the way. And I think that sometimes converting a protocol into an actual study that can be done in a clinical research setting is really challenging. And that's why we are here today. So hopefully you can learn from some of these areas that were my huge blind spots. The biggest thing that I have learned is that creating a team for your investigator-initiated trial is one of the best ways to help you along the way. So at Nationwide Children's Hospital and at Ohio State University, there are so many resources for you to tap into to help you with managing your investigator-initiated study. And one of the first ones is research administration staff. And these are people like me at Nationwide Children's and like Karen at Ohio State, who we exist to help great research happen at our institutions. I like to say that I'm a research matchmaker. It sounds kind of funny, but I like to try and find a need that a research team says they have and partner them with an existing resource. There are a ton of different cores at each of our institutions that are specialized and experts at meeting the need of research teams. So we have regulatory support, we have biostatistics support, we have clinical research support at both institutions. It's called the CRC at Ohio State, and it's called CRS at Nationwide Children's. We have so many different people that are able to help throughout the process. So chances are, if you're experiencing a point of pain or need some help with your study, there is someone that has expertise in that field that can help direct you. so that you can be successful in your study. So if you take away nothing else from this presentation, I want you to take away this little part. Please ask for help. There are people that are cheering you along that you maybe have never even heard of or seen, but we are here as part of the CCTS that spans both Ohio State and Nationwide Children's, and we can help point you in the direction of someone who can help you. So build your team. That's the number one thing I'm going to tell you. I think some of the other things I'm going to tell you are also pretty important, but that's the most important. So we have areas that I really think are important and useful, and one of them is regulatory affairs. And I think we have some regulatory affairs people on the line today from both institutions. But your regulatory affairs team are going to help you with all of the submissions, or they can help you with all of the submissions to the IRB. They can also help you with making sure your consent forms are written in plain language. They can help you with continuing reviews of your study. So make sure you know who your regulatory affairs people are, because they are amazing, amazing resources. Also make sure that you know who your sponsored projects officer or your business management team are. These are people who are specialists in contracts, financials, budgets, data sharing agreements. So if you and your PI want to bring in a collaborator and share data between your institution and somebody else's institution, a data sharing agreement is going to be something that's going to protect you and also make sure that the data and the privacy of your research participants is protected. So these are just important legal documents. Sometimes people say that legal and science don't mix, but in this case, they definitely do. There's also a lot of financials that go into an investigator-initiated trial. Usually, if you have a pharmaceutical company sponsoring your trial, you're earning money for the activities that you're performing as part of that clinical research program. But in an investigator-initiated trial, regardless of where the money is coming from, there's not some external person who's looking at the money and saying, oh, great, you enrolled a participant, you earn money for that. There's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes, and you want to be very cognizant of the financials and the budgets that go along with your studies. So this can mean a lot of spreadsheets, and all that math that we learned in middle school and high school and college, it's coming back. We're going to use it as part of an investigator-initiated trial. But there are people at both of our institutions who will help you manage your budgets. There's also a purchasing department and people who are called buyers, and their job is to help you make sure you are getting the best price on whatever it is that you are needing to acquire for your research program. So if you aren't already aware of these people at your institution, I would encourage you to ask your PI to figure out who these people are for your team. There's also a lot of other support that is part of the research administration staff, but I wanted to call them out individually. We have at Nationwide Children's a drug and device development office that is really knowledgeable in helping people move through the process of an IND or an IDE application. And their services are available to Ohio State and Nationwide Children's research programs. And we also have at Nationwide Children's the Office of Technology Commercialization, and I forget what it's called at Ohio State. There's so many acronyms at Ohio State, but I know that there is a similar office like this at Ohio State also. And these people help to make sure that if you are developing something new and generating intellectual property, that your intellectual property is protected. So these are also good people to know if you are working in any space where you're under an IND, an IDE, or generating intellectual property. The last people on this list are certainly not the last people in terms of who you want to contact when you're creating your team, but they're the other research and clinical laboratory staff that are in your department, division, or college, and other investigators, co-Is, and study staff. So I just saw my screen show that we've got 111 people on this call today. So there are other like-minded people who are doing similar work at each of our institutions, and they are going to be some of your best resources when you're creating a team for your IIT. There's also the clinical laboratory staff or the people who are in the division or department clinically where you're doing this research, they're going to be able to give you a lot of good input in the planning phases so that you can execute an excellent clinical research study. So this is just an idea of who else might need to be involved. Maybe you need the pharmacy, maybe you need radiology, labs, nutrition, the biobank. Did you guys know we have a huge biobank at Nationwide Children's called the Biopathology Center, the BPC, that collects specimens from international locations and stores them on site at Nationwide Children's. And we also have an off-site location that's closer to Ohio State. It's off of Kinnear. But there are a lot of clinical services and also your non-clinical partners. Don't forget the IT team. They're very important, especially in this new remote age that we are all in with COVID. Our IT team and making sure that everything we're doing is on secure servers, they are so important. But we also have, again, biostatistics, sponsored projects, marketing. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But there is a specific team at each of our institutions that helps with marketing, with research, and with recruitment for our studies. So that is somebody who's not necessarily a clinical partner, but might need to be part of your planning and implementation for your study. And then again, the coordinators and the nurses. So if you have a study that is going to involve clinical research coordinators or clinical research nurses, my philosophy is that asking them for their input early and often is only going to help your study run more smoothly throughout the process. And maybe you have an IIT that's already enrolling, already moving along and enrolling people. I think that asking for feedback from the people who are engaging with your participants is really valuable, and you might find that in the flow of how the protocol is written or how the lab manual is written, there might be something that can be improved on. And if it's not going to impact the outcomes of the study, and you can do something that will make the whole study run a little bit more smoothly, having the feedback from the coordinators and nurses is really, really valuable in overall how your study is conducted. So if you haven't started yet and you're wondering, where do I start? Everything comes back to the science. So if you remember the definition, an IIT is an investigator who had an idea who now has support and funding to execute that idea. And that idea is written down in the protocol. So if you are ever in doubt of where do I start, what do I do, go back to the source, and that's your protocol. So we're gonna go from that big team view and we're gonna shrink it all the way down to your specific study and your specific protocol. So most often, the protocol is already written or drafted by the principal investigator. And if it's drafted, it might be in a little bit of like an idea form and not necessarily in a protocol form, but they had to write something in order to get funding. So there should be some idea written down that you can read. If it is written, you need to review it very carefully before moving forward to make sure that it is in a format that actually looks like a protocol that can be implemented as a research program. So if your protocol is not yet finalized, collaborating, this is where I said getting that input from other partners is how you're going to be successful. So this is a quote from somebody in Clinical Researcher magazine that I really like about collaboration, because it talks about bringing so many different teams together. It says collaboration is not just about the clinical, regulatory, safety, and statistical input that we seek, but also about insights from independent scientific reviewers, patient advocates, and peers, all of whom can provide important perspectives on matters not directly related to the scientific research topic. And one of the reasons I have this quote in here is because we at the CCTS actually have a community engagement team that works to have external people, so people who are not scientists, who aren't part of clinical research, they can look at your protocol, they can give you input and feedback, and our community engagement team is really great about helping investigators kind of shape their studies before they get launched into the world, so that we have the valuable feedback from those community stakeholders that can help us be successful. We also can ask our friends I highly doubt that all of you are only friends with people who work in clinical research. You probably have at least one friend who's not in the sciences. And if you're working on something and you're thinking like, I wonder if the normal person would do this. I wonder if the normal person would come for 3 days in a row to have their blood drawn as part of this study, and we're only going to give them $5 to cover their parking. But in reality, at Ohio State, I know that $5 is not going to cover your parking. I've heard that the parking there is quite challenging. But ask around. You don't have to tell them all of the details of your study, but ask around. Get input from all these different places, because that's only going to make your science and your study more able to recruit, to operate more smoothly, and hopefully get you all the data that you need to meet the outcomes that are in your protocol. So when you are reviewing that research protocol, your goal as a clinical research coordinator or a clinical research administrator is to fully understand what your investigator wants for a patient population, what they want as the design of the study, what procedures or assays or tests or observations are going to be performed, what data needs to be collected, and the study goals and outcomes. So if we flipped this, I actually think the study goals and outcomes is the thing that you need to have the most clear understanding of, because those goals and outcomes are going to drive all of the other parts of your study, especially when it comes to patient population. Well, I say especially when it comes to patient, especially when it comes to all of these. The outcomes of the study, the goals of the study are going to drive all of those other bullet points. So thorough understanding leads to successful implementation. And sometimes it can seem like you're asking a million questions, but a million questions are exactly what is needed to make sure that we are conducting the study to get the data that's going to let our investigators make determinations based on the science that was proposed in that protocol. So if you don't already have meetings set up with your investigator or with somebody on your study team that can help you understand all of these details, I would encourage you to try and set up those meetings and just kind of keep a running list as you're going through and as you're learning. Even if you're in the middle of a study, there's always a chance to pivot or to offer additional training or to change a recruitment method. There's always a chance to make these small changes and tweaks. I have some examples of times where I actually had to change a database based on the type of outcome that was needed and the data we were collecting. They didn't quite match. So there's always time to make changes also if you're in the middle. But keep a running list of those questions, get answers, and also keep a record of those answers. Because even if you made a change 2 months ago, you might need to make a change again in the future, and having a history of those changes and why they were made is really helpful, especially if there is turnover of coordinators in your lab, or you're bringing in somebody new and they say, well, why are we doing it this way? You're going to be able to educate them and say, well, this is the desired outcome and this is how we were doing it and this is how we made a change so that we could better address that goal. And I think that this is one of the areas that in clinical research we're told to document everything. And we're usually really good about documenting our source data and documenting things that are needed in the protocol. But sometimes we forget to also document the process of the study. And usually if you're having communications like this back and forth with your sponsor, you're printing those out and they're going in your correspondence binder. But when your sponsor is your investigator, sometimes those conversations can happen verbally or in lab meeting, and we forget to write down why we're making changes or why we're doing things the way that we are. So just make sure that you have that understanding and that you're documenting why you're doing what you're doing, because the management of an investigator-initiated study can be very complex and there are a lot of moving parts. And the more you write down, the more you're going to help yourself and any future coordinators who come along for your study. If you haven't already figured out, I'm very type A. I like to plan things, I like to keep spreadsheets, I like to keep checklists, and I'll be sharing one of my checklists with you at the end of this. But every minute you spend in planning saves you 10 minutes in execution. I wish I made up this quote, because this Brian Tracy guy, he knows He knows that this is so true. You're getting an 1,000% return on your energy for every minute you spend planning. So sometimes this can be really hard because your investigator wants to go, go, go. Just remind them that the more effort you put on the front, the better it's going to be when you actually get to start enrolling people. And I know that we have had twists and turns and so many things thrown at us over the last few months with the stopping and the starting and the restarting of research. But really taking that time to plan is what is going to let you be successful in your studies. Another name for all of this planning, we call it at Nationwide Children's the feasibility process. There is a whole team of feasibility coordinators within clinical research services, but really what feasibility means is, can we do this? So this is a team that is going to carefully review the entire protocol, and you can do this yourself. You don't need to use the feasibility office, although at Nationwide Children's we highly recommend that you do. You're going to review the entire protocol, even the notes. Sometimes those little asterisks in the footnotes, that's where like the really good stuff is. So review the whole protocol, even the notes. You want to look at inclusion, exclusion criteria, the enrollment goals. This is so important, especially at Nationwide Children's and pediatrics. The enrollment goals and the amount of people we need to enroll, participants we need to enroll, it's really key. You want to look at all of those procedures, assays, observations that are going to be performed, and then the overall study design, the length of the study. How far does it deviate from the standard of care? What are we asking these people to do that they wouldn't normally be doing? The number of visits, the medication, if you're administering a medication or device, and the risks that are associated with it. Just looking at the entire study design is probably going to give you a really good idea as far as, can we do this? Also, when you look at that study design and look at the length, the number of visits, this is a really good time to have a conversation, if you haven't already, with your investigator about the amount of physical people it's going to take to do the study. Super important to make sure that you have enough staff to accomplish not just the visits themselves, but all of the documentation and data entry that happens after the visit. And then if you look at the samples and the data that need collected, this is a key part. If a result is needed in the protocol, then you have to obtain the sample and obtain the data. So if you are trying to correlate, let's just say, stress levels right now, because everybody is in such an immense area of change. If you're trying to correlate stress levels to something, and you're using cortisol to obtain that data point, you're going to have to obtain the sample, and you're going to obtain the data from the lab that runs it. And then you're going to have to put that into the database. So it seems super maybe intuitive to some people, but if you are trying to make a conclusion, you need to make sure that all of the data to back up that conclusion is accounted for. It's also tricky because if you're doing research on both campuses, Nationwide Children's and Ohio State, sometimes the result is reported differently by our laboratories. Some laboratories report in micrograms, some laboratories report in nanograms. So this is just something to be in your mind as you're planning, that it's something that seems little, but kind of working from the back, like the downstream, what you want, and then kind of working backwards, that is what is going to help you make sure that you're collecting all of the data that you need. Coming back to budget, I also really like budgets. This is something that I think is sometimes overlooked. Science is expensive, and there are so many studies that are left incomplete because there's no money left, or because you got going and it turned out that, oh my goodness, everything that was needed was so much more expensive than we thought it was going to be. And we thought we could enroll 100 people, but based on how much this costs, maybe we can only enroll 20. And then that's affecting the sample size. That's affecting the overall decisions that can be made based on the data. That becomes more of a pilot and less of a study. So there's just a lot that goes into a study on the financial end that I think is really challenging in investigator-initiated studies, because often we have these investigators, these physicians, these researchers that have great, amazing ideas. And scientifically, it could be the most brilliant idea that anybody has ever had. But then if you look at how much it's actually going to cost to operationalize that idea, that's where it gets a little tricky. So at the very beginning, I highlighted your sponsored projects officer and your research business team, your buyers and your purchasing professionals. Those are people who you want to make friends with. And you want to see if they can give you some expense reports or some quotes for how much things are going to cost. Because this is an area where it's really unfortunate if a study has to end early because of the budget. So this is something that I want you.
My headphones, but they're downstairs if you're going down.
Can everybody mute themselves, please? Thank you. This is something that I would encourage you to look into if you haven't already, or ask your investigator, like, hey, just can you give me a thumbs up that we're okay on budget? Because based on your funding, you might need to take that brilliant idea and modify it a little bit. Also, looking at your timeline, if somebody says, I'll give you this money for 1 year, if you have visits that have a 1 year or a 2 year follow-up, but you only have money for 1 year, you might need to modify your timeline. And this last one, are you going to be providing reimbursement to your participants? If you are, that needs to come out of your overall budget total that you've been awarded to execute this amazing idea. So these are just a few little things. Like I said, I'm just trying to give as much general information as I can, but these are a few little things where I have seen people get tripped up in the past, and I would love to avoid that for you. I know that participant reimbursement varies based on which college you're in. At Ohio State, at Nationwide Children's, it varies a little bit. Our IRB, though, is really great about helping you figure out what is an appropriate reimbursement for the design of your study. And so definitely check with your IRB as well if you have any questions about participant reimbursement. So another thing to consider are your actual study participants. And this first bullet point is a really important item to consider, because I don't know the exact data, but in a study from earlier, probably like 10 years ago, I think it said that about 30% of research studies don't recruit at all, zero recruitment, because there are no participants that actually meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria for that study. So when you are, if you're already in a study and you are struggling to enroll, please reach out, because we have things to help you. But if you have yet to enroll, before you even get started, make sure that you have participants that meet the inclusion and exclusion at your location. There are some data polls that can be conducted both at Ohio State and Nationwide Children's that can help you make a data-informed decision. So let's say you need 10 people, small sample size, 10 people to enroll in the next 6 months who have a kidney condition, that are already taking a certain medication, and that are female, and that are between 20 and 40 years of age. It's a very detailed example, but you only need 10, so it's fine. And your PI was like, yeah, I see those people all the time. Like we have enough. I see people like that in my clinic all the time. And you start enrolling, and you're doing screening, and you're looking, and you're looking, and you're looking, and oh, you finally found one. She's 26. She looks like she fits, but she has a chronic condition that's on the exclusion list. And this keeps happening and keeps happening. There is so much data that exists at both of our institutions that can help you make a decision that is totally objective. So instead of your PI or your physician saying, yes, I see these people all the time, you can get data that's completely objective that says, well, when I sort by all of our inclusion and then I add in all of our exclusion, I'm supposed to be finding 10 people in the next 6 months, but turns out you only see 4 people a year that actually would meet these criteria. So I would highly encourage you to start making some data-informed decisions based on inclusion and exclusion before you even start. And if you have started Again, you can always pivot, you can always change. But when possible, use data to inform the decisions that you're making about the operations of your study. This is also going to help you figure out if you can meet your enrollment goals. So in that same example, we know that we have 4 people a year that meet our criteria. It would be great if all 4 people said yes, but are 4 people going to be enough to actually give you meaningful data? There are biostatisticians at Nationwide Children's and at Ohio State that can help you review your sample size and make sure that if you do even recruit all 4 of those people, they can say, well, that's not really going to be enough to make a scientific conclusion. It'll show you a trend or it'll show you something, but there are biostatisticians that are available to help your investigator or help you as the clinical research coordinator kind of get in the direction that you need to go. Also, just something to consider, based on your participant age, that may affect the regulatory burden to develop consent and assent documents. So based on which institution you're at and what age group of children or adults you're working with, definitely make sure you're talking to your regulatory team about that. And recruitment. We have to get these people to agree to be in our study. So recruitment is a huge thing to consider in an investigator-initiated study, because there's no sponsor helping you find participants, or there's no sponsor giving you flyers that are already made. So these are all things as the clinical research coordinator we want you to be thinking about. So first is thinking about, where are you going to find people? Are you going to find them in a clinic? Are you going to find them out in the community? Where are you going to find them? If you are finding them within your hospital institution, just be considerate of the flow of the standard of care and make sure you're talking to the service line administrators or the nurses on the floor before you just barge in there and announce that you're doing clinical research. If there is marketing needed, both Ohio State and Nationwide Children's offer free recruitment and retention consultations through the CCTS, and we can help you with social media, with Facebook, with Twitter, with getting your message out there into the community. We can help you with flyers, there's a whole host of things. We can put together a full recruitment plan for you, and this is again through the CCTS, and it's linked on our website, the CCTS website, but I can also have Karen send out the direct links to request a recruitment consultation at Ohio State and Nationwide Children's. And then just one more thing to consider, if you have to involve other departments or other locations, you might need to look into reliance agreements or data use agreements or some of the other like legal and regulatory behind the scenes things. So you only found 4 of those kidney patients in a year. You need to now partner with somebody in Cleveland or somebody in Cincinnati to get more patients for your study. There's a lot that goes into that on the legal side and the regulatory side. So just be aware of that as another question to ask as you're planning. And more on the regulatory side, because regulatory is important. We want to keep our participants safe, we want to keep ourselves safe, and we want to follow all the rules and regulations that are necessary so that we are having good clinical practice and good research practice as we engage in these investigator-initiated trials. So make sure that you're following the consent and assent regulations. Always consult your local IRB. And if you're going to be working with a non-English speaking population, there is a portion of the CCTS that is specifically engaged with integrating special populations in research. And I would also encourage you to reach out for any assistance with recruiting any non-English speaking or even people with different cultural backgrounds. We have resources that can help you with that as well. I'm coming back to the teamwork, guys. This is so important. I can't stress it enough. I already told you at the beginning that this is the #1 thing. That's why I'm coming back to it. Expand your team. Figure out who else needs to be involved, determine where else you need help and expertise, and reach out. And if you don't want to reach out directly, please follow up with me or with Karen, and we will help you get to where you need to go. That also comes into play when you're talking about procedures, specimens. There are no training documents if you have an investigator-initiated trial. So that means the research team are the ones developing the manual of operations, the lab manual, or the specimen management plan. Consult your local lab that's running these samples. Consult the nurses who will be obtaining these samples. I know at Nationwide Children's there are different regulations for which types of medical professionals can obtain different types of samples and perform different types of procedures on research participants. So make sure you're consulting with those people before you start writing your standard operating procedures or even putting together a lab manual, because maybe you need 2 different types of blood samples, but one of them has to be drawn first and the other one has to be drawn second. There might be things that on the clinical end, maybe as a research team we're not aware of. So just really make sure you're considering all the people who need to be part of your team when you're developing these training manuals. Data. Data is another huge thing to consider when you are running an investigator-initiated trial. Because if you have a sponsored trial, usually they already have the database created. Sometimes they even send you worksheets you can use, and that is awesome. But remember, our investigator is our sponsor. So that means we're creating our own database. We're creating our own source documents. And these databases have to align with our protocol, with our lab manual. And so it's really important that you understand those downstream goals of your investigator, and you can help design the database to collect the data that they need, and also that you're designing source documentation that goes along with the Alcoa C principles of attributable, legible, timely. Contemporaneous is a big word. It just means timely, original, accurate, and complete. Because if you skip a step in data, that could dismantle your entire study. So when you're collecting your data, it is so important that you are documenting every procedure, every interaction, every lab result, every conversation. And if you're going to make changes to your database, remember how I said that you should write down all the answers to your questions? It's also really important to keep a data dictionary that talks about why you collected certain data points. So when you're defining the data points to be collected, you want to make sure that this integrates with your manual of operations and integrates with how the lab is going to process and report out the results. Also make sure it integrates with the patient IDs or participant IDs that you've assigned to your participants. Keep a data dictionary. It's critical, especially if another coordinator takes over. If you're asking a question, this is a real life example. If you're asking a question that says, do you smoke? And your participant says no. But then their hair sample comes back and they've got nicotine in their hair sample. Your data says that they didn't smoke. And that's the question that you asked them. But really what you wanted to know is, do you use any tobacco or nicotine products? This is why it's so important to keep a data dictionary and to keep notes, because all that question said was, do you smoke? But what the investigator really wanted to know, because they were measuring nicotine levels, was, does that participant use any nicotine or tobacco products? So it's just a small example of a way that asking a question and the way you think you're asking the question and what you think it means and how that investigator is actually going to use the data can be different. So keeping a data dictionary with notes so that each coordinator is asking the question the right way, and that you understand that, do you smoke? We actually went into the database and changed this question after we had figured this out. But that's just a small example of a way that how you define your data points to be collected and what you actually need from the data when you go to analyze it. It's so important to work backwards from those goals and objectives to when you design your data points. And then when you are creating your case report forms, when you're creating all of the worksheets where you're going to be collecting this data, do a mock visit with somebody else in your department, somebody else on your team, to make sure you've captured all the necessary source information before you go see a real person. Make sure that you have checks and balances within your own system, that you know you're taking their blood pressure, you know that you're checking their pulse, whatever else it is for their vital signs. Make sure in your source documents you have places to write down their pulse and their blood pressure, because once you're there with that patient, it's so easy if you don't have a checklist or you don't have a thorough case report form to miss a piece of data that you need to collect. And it's really hard to go backwards from an in-person visit and try and find that out later. This last couple things before we take questions. Data monitoring is one of the hardest things to do in an investigator-initiated trial. It is one of the most difficult aspects. Yet it's one of the things that your investigator is responsible for when they become the sponsor. Before you even start collecting data, I would highly encourage you to ask your investigator these questions. Who's going to be monitoring this data? How often? Which data points? Can we have somebody do it remotely, or do they need to be here at Ohio State looking at charts? Are we going to be doing risk-based? So only certain data points that are either safety data points or data points that are really critical to our outcomes? Or are they going to be looking at every single thing that we put into this database? Create a data monitoring plan. There are some great examples of data monitoring plans out there in the clinical research community. If you need some, you can feel free to send me an email and I can point you along the way. And there's actually a two-part series coming up in August through ACRP that I'm offering with another colleague of mine. Her name is Alex. And we are going to be talking about how to build a database and also about data monitoring. So if you need more help on this, there is more help coming. This last thing on the slide is one thing that investigators often don't think of until it's too late. So I'm just going to put this little bug in your ear so you maybe can help your investigator. If there is more than one investigator, or if there is any sort of partnership, PI, COI, decide before you begin who will own the data and who has the right to publish those findings. Oftentimes in pediatrics, we will diversify across multiple institutions in order to ensure we have a high enough sample size to draw conclusions. But if we have a lot of people all working together, once that data is available, who has the right to publish it first? Who has the right to be first author or last author? Figuring that out beforehand, instead of when the data is right in front of them and they really, really want to publish, but they can't figure out who actually owns the right to the data, it's just going to save you a lot of trouble. I'll just say that. It'll save you a lot of trouble on the back end. And I mentioned this at the beginning, but I just want to make sure we say it again, because my goal in presenting this to you all is that you stay safe and that you follow all of the policies and procedures for both financial and scientific discoveries that are outlined by our institutions, so that we have sound financial, legal, intellectual property. All of that is taken care of, because awareness of these policies will streamline anything downstream that could pop up. And I just want to make sure that we as the research administrators are taking good care of the science that's been entrusted to us. So make sure you're following the rules and check your blind spots. Everything that's on this page has been a blind spot of mine at one point. And I have learned from many real life examples. And if there's anything that's on this little grid that makes you say, what is that? Please reach out to me and I will help point you in the right direction. And if I can't help you, I promise you I'll find somebody who can. So these are my blind spots. This is also my last slide. If there are any questions that you've submitted to Karen, I've left myself a whopping 2 minutes to answer them. So if you are able to and willing to stay on the line, I can try and take a couple questions, but otherwise, hopefully you can email me at my contact information and we'll go from there.